Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Northwest Craftsman. Today I've got a special treat for you. We just got one of our first commissions to build something for somebody, and it's a family friend who lost a leg to one of their love seats in a recent move that they did, and I need to replicate it because the movers lost one, and you can't really sell a love seat that has 3 legs on it, and so it's just otherwise worthless. And this isn't just something that you can purchase on Amazon, so I'm going to go through and they gave me one of the legs so that I have the ability to replicate it, look at it, make sure that we're matching the form, the shape, and the color and everything. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to replicate and repair any furniture that falls into something like this category, because the steps are going to be very similar pretty much regardless of what you need to repair. All right, let's get started. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is get all of the rough dimensions for your part. You want to get the length, the width, and the depth. Don't worry about any of the curves yet because we're going to take care of that later. The purpose for this step is purely to get how large of a piece of raw stock we need to cut out. For this love seat foot, it's about 3 3/8 inches square, so a 4x4 should do the trick just perfectly, though I'm not going to be able to take the bull nose off of each one of the corners because that would take too much of it off. Once you've chosen your raw stock, go ahead and dimension it so that it's the right size and each one of the faces is pretty well finished off. An important note when you're using your planer is that you want to make sure your raw stock is long enough to cover both of the rollers plus some so that it is stable going through. Too short of a piece and it will lose contact with the rollers and get chewed up by the blade and possibly cause harm to you and to the planer itself. Next up, I just wanted to quickly clean up both of the edges before I actually cut it down to the proper length. After cleaning up those ends, I want to go ahead and measure out what the raw stock needs to be cut down to get my final piece. The way that I did this is I lined up the piece on top of my raw stock, and then I took my square, lined it up next to the edge so that I made sure that I wasn't measuring it incorrectly, and marked that line straight across. Quickly double check your work to make sure that you didn't make a mistake, and then you're ready to cut this guy down to size. Now that it's cut out, we're going to go ahead and mark the curves. On this one it's pretty simple, I can just trace it off of this, but it really depends on the piece that you're trying to replicate as to how you trace the curves out. You may have to get a little bit more creative with it, but in this case I could just set it on there nicely and then draw it out with a pencil. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and do a rough cut just on the outside of my line, being very careful with my fingers because they're going to get naturally kind of close to this. Another thing to note is that I've got a 1/2 inch blade on my bandsaw, as you see right here, which is not the best for cutting curves. There's only a minimum diameter or a maximum diameter that I can cut with this. So if you're going to be trying to make tight corners, you're going to want to put a 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch blade on there so that you can really get it tight. And if you've got enough throat on a scroll saw, go ahead and do it there because you should be able to get it exactly how you need it. Something else you may have caught that I missed when I was doing this is that my other marking for the other curve was on that scrap piece that I just cut off. There's 2 possible solutions to this. One is to be more careful when you're marking them at first so that you don't cut off the edge that you need, or in this case what I ended up doing is I just stacked the piece of wood or the scrap piece on top of it so that it was able to hold the curve. You need to be really careful when you're doing this though, because if you get any shift in that workpiece, you're going to get a bad cut on the second part. In this case, even though I had a little bit misaligned, it turned out perfectly. And in this step, I'm doing one last form check to make sure that everything looks good. Next up comes the sanding, which is just the preparation for the finish. I moved from 80 to 120 to 220 grit, and the reason I used my random orbital sander is because it was going to allow me to more quickly sand this down. A random orbital sander is okay in this portion, but it would really be better to use a belt sander because it's going to be able to go with the grain the entire time rather than crossing the grain, which is going to leave you with a smoother, better finish in the end. You really just want to make sure that you're able to keep that curve without knocking down the edges and get all of the scratches out of there. Next up, we're going to spray the workpiece with a little bit of water so that it raises the grain and allows us to knock that down so that after we apply the pre-stain and finish, we won't have a raised rough grain on the part. Unlike with the cutting board, I found it was easier just to load up a squirt bottle and bring it out to the shop because this is something that I'm now doing on a fairly regular basis. It seemed to work pretty well, and I'm definitely going to keep doing it. Next, you're going to go ahead and dry off the workpiece so that it's not sopping wet before you sand it one more time with 220 grit to knock down any of that raised grain. Alright, now comes the most fun and rewarding, or the most infuriating part of the entire project, depending on what colors you have to match and what wood you have to work with. The original feet for the love seat were made out of a hardwood, and hardwoods absorb stain very nicely and evenly, almost regardless of where they're applied. The problem that I ran into is that I was using pine to replace this, which does not absorb stain evenly all the way across. In fact, in many cases it can turn out blotchy or zebra striped in my case, because the softer, pulpier sections of the wood absorb stain a lot faster than the rings, which leads to what we see as this zebra striping. Now the way to combat this is pre-stain. To make sure I could get the most uniform finish, I created 2 test coupons for stain. On the left of both of these test coupons is 10 parts water to 1 part glue mixture, and on the right is the commercial pre-stain from Varathane. I allowed both of these coupons to rest overnight so that they were prepped for a test the next morning. So one of the things that you'll notice with the pre-stain on the right is that it does affect the raw look of the wood. It is a lot darker, although the glue, I think you can still see it a little bit, is not nearly as noticeable as the pre-stain. I don't think this is going to matter much because most of the time that you're using pre-stain, you have a dark colored stain that you're applying to the wood, not a more natural, lighter colored stain, which you would just go with more of a clear finish. Already in this short period of time, you can see the difference in absorption rates. In the center with the untreated wood, you can see how the soft pores absorb a lot more of the stain than the rings. This causes that sharp zebra striping. The right, which has the pre-stain applied to it, you can see that the stain just kind of sits on the top, though it does absorb into the pores. And then on the left, the wood glue mixture still seems to be absorbing a lot of the stain, although it seems to be absorbing into the rings more evenly than in the untreated portions of the wood. I'll speed up the last portion of this clip so that you can really see the difference in absorption rate. After letting this sit for about 3 to 5 minutes, I then went ahead and blotted all of it out and wiped it down. The difference between the treatment methods couldn't be more clear. Even though the match wasn't perfect, the pre-stained version of the pine was a lot better and a lot closer to the original leg. After giving it a little bit of time, I applied a second coat of stain to that coupon and the color came even closer. Even though it's not perfect, this is the process that I'm going to end up using. Lastly, I need to replicate the mechanical components, which include this fastener on top and the glide on the bottom. The top fastener is pretty easy because I just need to find the center of the top and then go ahead and drill a pilot hole that allows me to thread a small 3-inch piece of all thread into it. The 2 nuts you see were added by me so that I could actually get grip on the piece of all thread and move it in. The way that you put them together is that you tighten one down into the other and it creates a firm, steady grip so that you can actually fasten it together. This will also be used once I get to the final love seat so that I can adjust how far in the foot goes and at what angle it sits because it's a non-symmetric piece of furniture and so there is one correct orientation depending on which corner of the love seat it is in. The glides are even easier in this because you can just get some nailing glides from your local hardware store that just nail straight into the bottom. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and stop it there because the rest of the project is really just me applying the stain and the finish to it, and that's really pretty boring overall in the scheme of things. Some of the things that I learned during this are when you're marking your piece of wood to try and replicate where you're going, take note of what you're going to be cutting off because when I went through and took my first cut, I realized that I cut the marking off for the other side, and so I had to get a little bit creative with that. And then also if you're trying to do any color matching with your stains, honestly, that took the most time for me because I had to go through 3 different stains that I was trying to test and different surface preparations. And the pine that I was using to replace this foot, pine sucks for stain, honestly, is what I'm seeing on this. And unless you're trying to get like a really good zebra stripe going, all of the soft pulpy wood between the different rings absorbs really fast, and so the rings look almost white compared to the very dark, pulpy areas. And so a little bit of pre-stain goes a long ways into evening that out, and that's actually the stain that I ended up, or that's the surface prep plus stain that I ended up going with for this because it was the closest match to it. Of course, if you're trying to get an exact match, you should really try to match the same wood. I believe this is a piece of walnut. It's just that trying to find a 4x4 of walnut was going to be kind of tough, and so I decided I was just going to replace it with pine and get a look that was close enough because it didn't need to be a perfect match. All of this depends on how close your match needs to be for the final piece of furniture, so go ahead and make the decisions that are the best for your project and kind of the look that you need in the end. So thank you guys very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you have any comments, comments or questions, go ahead and leave it in the area down below. And then if you wanted to subscribe or like this video, absolutely love to have you as a part of the community and see you guys around again. So, all right, have a great one. Talk to you guys later. Bye.